and to show how this particular form of continental integration that's being proposed does not work for Greens, it does not work for the environment, it does not work for democracy, social justice, or human rights. So this Security and Prosperity Partnership follows upon a whole history of continental attempts at continental integration that go way back in history and invasions and so on, and various forms of reciprocity and annexation, leading up to finally NAFTA, when they kind of cemented a form of economic integration at a very low level, a free trade association. And one of the objectives of NAFTA, if you read the 5 main points of it, was to be a base for further integration. And so this many years later, in 2005, the time was right for leaders to advance this Security and Prosperity Partnership of North America. And so they met, that was in March of 2005, in Waco, Texas. And they didn't actually sign an agreement. They shook hands and they talked about an agreement. And the reason they didn't sign it, they didn't want a treaty like NAFTA was, because they knew people would have to see it. It would have to be transparent, and they didn't want that because they knew that people wouldn't want what they were proposing. And so it's been a very secretive process from our perspective in Canada. And from what I hear in the U.S., most people don't know about it. So we have a very, very large NGO, civil society movement now that's tracking this and trying to bring it into public life. And there was a major meeting March 31st in Ottawa where nearly 1,000 people came together and basically said we're launching a movement. And there was one political panel, and Elizabeth May was part of that, and basically said that this will be an election issue for the Green Party in Canada. Next. So just to give you, I wonder if I can see this here as well. No, I guess not. So basically, the reason that it's called the Security and Prosperity Partnership, the prosperity is the trade side, and that's a kind of NAFTA plus attempt to move towards customs union and possibly even monetary union. And the security came out of it's a post-11 initiative where the United States decided that security trumps trade and that it would be the framework for all policy. And I think we'll just sit through some of this. That is the cover. This is the Security and Prosperity symbol on the United States government SPP website. There were, after the agreement in March of 2005, they immediately set up, I think I've got the numbers wrong there, anyway, they set up about 13 prosperity groups and 6 security groups, and they said that each year the groups that were in place would meet with and bring their reports to the leaders, that is our Prime Minister and the President, and that twice a year these working groups would meet with the top ministers of the 3 countries, being like foreign minister, industry minister, and so on. And so they're working at a fairly high level. And these committees are mostly big business and government bureaucrats. So of course, it's worrisome. The NGOs have not been invited into this process. Some academics, but not the NGOs. Next. So those are some of the committees that were set up at the time. You see energy, environment, financial services, business facilitation. And this is, within 3 months, they were told to report back. And they did, with great big frameworks, with all their objectives in place and moving forward at a very fast rate. Well, next. So the working group progress was that they reported back in June with their big spreadsheets and their initiatives that they were going to advance. And then in March, they met in Cancun. And so if you go to the Government of Canada or the American government website under spp.gov, you'll see these progress reports that have been presented. And, okay, next. That was just the transportation working group, because I've also been working on the whole idea of the NAFTA super corridors. And so I wanted to show how the transportation working group is advancing the whole notion of multimodal corridors and super corridors. And when I say super, I mean, like football, let's see, a quarter of a mile wide with 12 lanes and 6 trucking lanes. And that's the worrisome thing when we look at greenhouse gas emissions. Next. And there's an energy working group set up. Now, what these working groups have done, in some cases, after NAFTA was signed, there were working groups. For example, with energy, there was an energy working group, and some of those have just kind of merged into the SPP, and then in other cases, new groups have been set up. Next. So that's just, in 2006, they announced some new initiatives. They announced, no, back one, oh sorry, two down, one more. And they announced this North American Competitiveness Council, and that's a bit worrisome. That's a very kind of aggressive, business agenda, where they were meeting with the senior ministers, mostly heads of large corporations that are going to be involved with the security initiative contracts and weapons contracts and so on. And that was begun by that was sponsored here in the United States by the Council of the Americas, and which was the group in '65 that began the whole idea of fast track and NAFTA and so on. The other thing, is the North American Energy Security Initiative. Now, in Canada, we worry about this because one of the things behind this is, and right from the beginning, before NAFTA, was that the United States needs energy, of course, to keep the whole machine moving and the empire going. And so, in this deal, Canada is considered to be the natural resource part of this North American economy. And it's very much about a North American economy with very little talk about conservation or efficiency of energy or anything. It's just about keeping the oil flowing. And I'll show you in a few minutes where it's coming from, out of the tar sands of Alberta, which is a very dirty, messy process. So, next. So we also found that there's been freedom of information requests to find out more about this. And as I was starting to mention, this North American Competitiveness Council came out of the Council of the Americas. And so very much of this is being run by these business organizations in the United States and the Council of Foreign Relations, and in Canada, the CCCE, the Canadian Council of Chief Executives, are the top corporations in Canada. It's very much their agenda. And they wrote the North American Security and Prosperity Initiative in 2003, and lo and behold, when the Security and Prosperity Partnership came out, it was called, almost the same. And basically, the big business group in Canada said, "This is, we got what we wanted." They said that in their press release. So next. So this is just a report by a researcher, who in Canada, who does research on fascism, and he said, next slide, he's extremely worried that what he sees in the closeness of big business and government right now in America and right across the Americas, that it's a very worrisome trend. Next. Okay, I'm not going to take time to go into all of this, but if you Google something called Vive le Canada, there's a timeline, or just to Google actually SPP timeline. And there's a very extensive one there that shows all the meetings that led up to the signing of the SPP. Just here, this one's just going back to 1999. And one of the driving forces in the U.S. has been Robert Pastor, the third one down, who is a professor at the American University in New York. And he has written many, many papers on North American community and moving towards this North American Union. So he is the driving force. And in the United States, though, people who are worried about this always cite Robert Pastor. In Canada, we've had senior ministers from previous governments very involved in this, and also the key negotiators of NAFTA have stayed with it right through and are now have been working to get this going. One of the groups that was set up was the Task Force on the Future of the Americas, and just before the SPP was released, there was a Task Force on the Future of the Americas report released as well. They're all saying basically the same thing, that we need this deeper integration. Okay, next. Just keep going, I think, here. Okay, now, I don't know if you recall that your ambassador to Canada, Paul Cerrucci, he wasn't a big hit because he was constantly telling Canada what they needed to do, and he was the one that said security trumps trade, and this is when we realized that the agenda was for a fortress North America, so that Canada was supposed to harmonize all of its border policies with those of the U.S., and so that meant it affected the way we treat immigrants in our country, and it made some pretty major shifts that had infractions of human rights, of the way students come into our country and so on. So this has been the security side of the agenda, and it's also led to major surveillance moves with databases and so on, which our analysts have said are very worrisome in terms of human rights. We've been able to not go quite as far, but when after 9/11, when the Patriot Act came out here, as Maud Barlow says in one of her books on this, basically a template was sent out from this country, and all other countries were expected to follow suit. But in Canada, with all the human rights organizations and the academics, there was a huge clamor against it, so we didn't have to get signed in quite as far. But we've still gone too far as we're concerned, and we got caught up in the torture thing, and there are major opposition to this now. Next. I'm not going to go into all of that. I gave you kind of an idea of some of the key reports. That's Thomas D'Aquino. He's the head of the Chief Executive, the Canadian Council of Chief Executives. They used to be the Business Council on National Initiatives. They've been there. He's been there from the beginning. And this is the thing. The people that have been pushing this have been around for a long time, and they're very, very well connected at very high levels. And the problem is that ordinary citizens don't have any say, NGOs aren't having any say, and it's going on behind the scenes. So they're next. Okay, I told you about the task force that was set up next. And okay, and then we get up to signing it. There's been all kinds of other agreements, like there's been the Smart Border Accord, then there's been the Smart Regs, and the Smart Regs is a very concerning process because it puts it's really clawing back regulations that have been put in place and progressive legislation on the environment and so on. Next. And so that's the Council on Foreign Relations, was where this whole Task Force on the Future of North America was kind of housed. Next. Okay, and then the CAFTA was passed in July 2005. This is all part of the broader agenda to have these trade routes that will go right from one tip of the hemisphere to the other. And I'll show you the corridors in a minute. We're just coming up to that. Then both the main parties in Canada have been involved in this. The Liberal government under Prime Minister Martin was the one that got into this, and now Stephen Harper, who we consider to be a kind of George Bush clone in our country, and who's doing some very damaging things. He was elected in January, so he's carrying this forward. Next. Okay, and so we have coming up now. This March was the 3rd anniversary when the leaders should have met, but they decided against it, maybe because the NGOs in Canada launched a great challenge to the SPP called Integrate This, when the 1,000 activists and so on came together. So they canceled it, and it's now being held August the 20th and 21st in Montebello, Quebec at a retreat. And so the Green Party is going to be involved in that, and we're going to try to have some kind of a summit ourselves there. And so we want to reach out to people from Green Party US and Mexico and see what we can mount. But it's all in the early planning stages at this point. Next. And these are just some of the kinds of, we've had many, between the 2000 and up to 2005, there were many major conferences in Canada held to discuss, because we knew this was coming, and we were trying to figure out how we could have some really good debate on it and maybe move us in other directions, because what we saw was that the security really was moving us towards insecurity, and on these many fronts, because the SPP will increase the so-called harmonization, of not only regulations, but it's moving us towards deeper military integration, social integration, as for example, healthcare, prying open the public healthcare system we have and so on to move towards American model, and so on. So anyway, there's many reasons why we feel that we really need to reconsider this. Next. So why should we reject this? Because we know that we know trade is good, and we know regional trading blocks can work, but it's because of the way this is being pushed through, and because really what it's leading to is supranational structures that will take away any opportunity for citizens or even political parties to have an influence in this. And we know that those supranational structures that are being planned will be heavily dominated by large business, not small business. You know, small businesses in the United States as well as in Canada recognize that this is not an agenda that assists in that in any way. So, and the biggest flaw, assumption, is that NAFTA worked. If you see why they're implementing this, besides the security side, they all say NAFTA worked. Well, what we're finding now is that even The Economist says NAFTA was oversold. We're finding our economists are saying, sure, we had increased trade because of NAFTA, but a lot of it in Canada was due to our devalued dollar. Now that our dollar has gone up, it's not as advantageous. But there were also a whole lot of promises from NAFTA, promises of better jobs, of more investment. And anyway, now people are sitting down and analyzing whether that really transpired, and it didn't in many cases, and it needs to be rethought. And the same for Mexico. Mexico had not had the promises that they should have had, and many say that because of that is really the cause of all the migration to the north, because there's no jobs there, you know. And so recently I saw on YouTube a professor in California at Berkeley, and he said he was sold on this. He was a neoliberal to the core, and he truly believed that this was going to equalize things for Mexico, and it would raise the democratic level there, it would raise the income level and everything, and it didn't. And he was basically standing there talking to his students and saying, I'm totally shocked. I don't know how this is, and I really have no idea where to go, because they don't think about alternatives the way we do. And so I think what this demands is a real dominant kind of paradigm shift in terms of how we view the world. And it means that we do have to move to another scale. And this mega scale that they're still putting forward now is just so unsustainable. So the flawed assumptions, there's a whole lot of reasons I've already mentioned. The loss of sovereignty is huge right now. And as this goes forward, we're seeing that we aren't going to have the ability to control it. It hasn't come, none of this has come before our Parliament in Canada. None of it's come before Congress. Most people don't know about it. So it really is just going on, and somehow the media is controlled not to talk about it. Mm-hmm. And we found that out by candidates in other parties who have tried. And recently we found out there was a secret meeting in Banff in September, quite a secretive meeting, with very, very high-level people there, from the military, from the Pentagon, you know, from the highest levels of government. And there was a document that was released, which was advice to the planners of that event to stay shy of the media. And it was quite a revealing document. They even went so far as to say, to tell the media, it was just an NGO, you know, and it was just a low-level meeting and all of this sort of thing. So next. And I don't have time to go into it, but if you look at all of these security arrangements that have been put in place, from the Smart Border to the Patriot Act and the surveillance, you'll know and you'll understand, as in this country, that there's violations now of human rights and civil rights and so on from this, that we need to be very conscious of. It's a thin edge of the wedge in terms of some of the surveillance. And so here's the super corridors. Now, this is a kind of, you know, what people project from these super corridors. Right now, it's the first inkling of this is coming through Texas with the Trans-Texas Corridor, which was temporarily stopped, a 2-year moratorium put on, and then we hear that that moratorium now is off, so we're not sure. But there's been major opposition to it. Next. So those are some of the projections of where the super corridors would go, and the idea would be that they'll be building major super ports in Mexico, which could bypass some of the ports in California and Los Angeles, because they're too slow right now. And also, if the goods come through Mexico, there'll be cheaper labor and truckers and so on. And then the other projected ports would be on the East Coast, and there's one in my province of Nova Scotia projected for Halifax, and they're lobbying the business community to have that. And then, of course, the goods would come in from China on these super container ships, which now are they're just absolutely massive, and they're building one every 90 days in China to just keep that whole trade chain going. And then it'll be trucked down through into the hinterland, into the Walmarts and everything. And so you can just picture how unsustainable that is if you know how many emissions these big trucks put out. So next. This is an artist diagram of these super corridors, which would have 6 trucking lanes at a time when we know that we need to be cutting back on emissions. Next. Next. These are just like some of the impacts that some of the opposition groups have identified with these corridors. The eminent domain thing is huge. It'll usurp, just thousands of acres of land. Loss of businesses in hundreds of communities. It divides communities. It divides habitats and ecosystems. The costs of the misplaced funding. There will be toll highways. It's totally a privatization scheme, and they'll be controlled by big investment funds and companies from Spain and from Australia and from Sweden. And this is going on not just with super corridors, it's going on. Julia and I were looking at an article in Mother Jones on the highwaymen, and there are these investment funds now that are lobbying mayors all over the country to privatize the highways. They consider a public sector highway dead capital. This kind of terminology we're hearing. We're hearing this doublespeak from them, which masks, the good of the public sector and tries to denigrate it and show it as just being useless. Next. And next, and next. And then we've got cross-border regions as well. In addition to those, the broader integration picture under the Prosperity Partnership, they're also working at the cross-border level because they know there's more trade at the cross-border level and there's more cultural kinds of joinings and so on. And so in my region, it's called Atlantica, and in the Pacific, it's the Pacific Northwest Economic Region. And so there's big business and governments of all levels are working together to build the superports and to the highways and the pipelines. Now let's move on quickly and get into the energy. That's just to show the shipping routes. Right now, these ships are so big, they call them post-Panamax because they won't go through the Panama Canal. And so now that gives us an advantage up in the east coast of North America that some of the ships can come through the Suez and then into our ports. And so that's why they're pushing that aspect of it. Next. So that's just to give you a look. This is from a Statistics Canada document. North America increasingly appears to be a single continental market tied together by ribbons of steel and asphalt. North America is now one market for overseas container trade, with ports in Canada and the U.S. competing with each other for traffic to the interior of North America. So, next. And so you can imagine what we call this, we envision now as the port in Halifax, it's a conduit for goods. It's also, Atlantica is a conduit for energy to come down, offshore oil and gas. And under NAFTA, we have to keep providing the same proportion of oil and gas that we have over the past 3 years. And right now, Canada supplies 60% of all of its oil to the U.S. And so if we run short, we can't change that. We have to just, keep providing it. Next. So you can see that this kind of a system, it's going to increase global warming, the demand for our dirty tar sands oil, which I'll talk about in a minute. This is why they want the labor market too. So this whole SPP, will increase labor mobility and investment mobility right across the Americas. And the head of Atlantica that's been promoting this actually said that they will be able to use non-unionized Mexican labor in these trucks that will be forcing the highways. Okay, now I'm not going to have time for the energy timeline. Let's just zip through that, but there is one, and then I just want to show you quickly the. Yeah, there. And we get down to the energy-related. Okay, so the energy-related aspects here are the oil, the tar sands in Alberta, and the natural gas in the Mackenzie Valley, uranium from Saskatchewan, and water. We're not going to talk about water. Okay, next. Okay, this is just to give you an idea of the tar sands. Next. And the development that's going on there is just phenomenal. In terms of size and magnitude and lack of control. Next. They're just digging up it's like a mixture of bitumen and sand, and it takes, next, and next. Okay, the problem with it is it's water guzzling. They say that the rivers in Alberta are already running dry from this, and it's taking natural gas, as much energy to get it out almost as they'll get back from it. Habitat destruction is phenomenal, and the greenhouse gas emissions. It's why Canada has not been able to meet our Kyoto standards. It's because of that this is so intensive in terms of that. There's huge major health issues now as well, and The next. Okay, and next. And now they want to develop the Mackenzie Valley to bring the gas down, not only so that we can meet the requirements that we have with the U.S. to supply natural gas, but so that we can supply the gas to get the tar sands out, which doesn't make any sense at all. Next. And then the other thing, we've got Saskatchewan, which is where one of the largest sources of uranium in the world, and that is being mined now and shipped down for nuclear power. And in the Green Party of Canada, we do not agree with nuclear power. So we have a lot of issues, and nuclear power is linked also to weapons production. So we have to view uranium in a whole cycle. We can't look at DU on its own and nuclear energy. It's all linked. Okay. Next. So those are you can't see. Next. This is where the pipeline would come from the Arctic to bring down the gas, and there are these pipelines now being constructed all over, from Canada down to the U.S. And the amount of greenhouse gases with this mega model is quite phenomenal. So I think that what we have to realize is that with globalization is based on fossil fuel, and the proponents of it keep thinking only of fossil fuel because they want to keep the mega model going, and the transportation networks are mega, as we've seen, and the agriculture is mega with agribusiness model, and the manufacturing is all being done in these mega factories in places like China, and it's all linked to that dominant model, and we need to think on another scale now if we're going to survive on this planet. Thank you.